Well, good morning and welcome to week 7 of Common Practice. My name is Matt Rustin. I'm the executive director at Made to Flourish. And this Common Practice webinar series that we've been doing is our regular check-in where we can come together as pastors and leaders of organizations to talk about the ways that we can be shepherding the church and our organizations in these really challenging times. And really excited about our conversation today. Our topic, as you likely know, is pastoring with an entrepreneurial mindset. And whether you're a pastor or not, I wonder how many of us that are tuning in today, how many of us think of ourselves as entrepreneurs? Maybe that word entrepreneur calls to mind people like Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook, or Elon Musk at Tesla, or Oprah Winfrey, or whoever the entrepreneur is that comes to your mind. But a lot of really smart people are saying that at this time when so many things are disrupted, the fundamental skills that entrepreneurs rely on to do their work is so important for all of us who lead organizations and who do our work. We all need to develop an entrepreneurial mindset. In fact, our friends at Praxis, they've said every organization is a startup now. In other words, we're all having to think of brand new ways to do the work that we've done in the past. It doesn't look the same anymore because it's changed. And it feels maybe for some of us like a muscle that was kind of out of shape when this whole thing began. But we've been getting a workout these last few months, haven't we? We've had to imagine new ways of doing things. As church leaders, if you're a pastor, you were in the gathering people business, right? The formation business, gathering people, and that has all gone away. We've had to reimagine how to do this. We're not able to practice sort of an incarnational ministry presence in people's lives. So what now? And while tools like this, Zoom and other platforms, have filled in a certain amount of gap, there are still many challenges that are left unanswered and require new entrepreneurial ways of looking at things. People are experiencing massive economic upheaval, for example, in our congregations. How do we help them and shepherd them through this time? So whether you yourself think of yourself as a full-blown entrepreneur or not, we're going to be talking today about these fundamental skills and mindsets and practices that are so common and important in all of our leadership. So that's our conversation today, and we've got 3 amazing panelists who are friends of mine and friends of Made to Flourish, and they're going to be helping us think about this topic today. The first panelist that we're going to be talking to is Michaela O'Donnell Long, and she's the Senior Director at the Dupree Center and at Fuller Seminary, and she's an adjunct instructor of practical theology and leadership at Fuller. Her doctoral work was right in this topic that we're talking about today. Her doctoral dissertation was called Adopting an Entrepreneurial Posture, Vocational Formation for a Changing World of Work. And Michaela's not just an academic, she's also an entrepreneur herself. She started a company called Longer Winter Media. That's a vibrant creative agency that helps brands make social impact through multimedia content. She's worked with people like YouTube and Google and NBC Universal and lots of companies that we would know about. So grateful to have Michaela joining us today. And Michaela, would you talk just a little about your work and your context?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Like Matt said, I'm kind of part entrepreneur, part academic, which, as it turns out, many people think those things don't go together. But I have found a happy synergy. Like he said, I work at Fuller, where we do different research projects, create resources for people who want to engage these topics, specifically at the Dupree Center. And like you said, I run Longer Media. I've also got a husband and 2 small kids to give you a picture of what my quarantine life is like. So I'm glad to be here today.
Excellent. Thanks, Michaela. Looking forward to chatting a little bit later. Travis Lowe is our second panelist, and Travis Lowe is the senior pastor at Crossroads Church in Bluefield, West Virginia, and he's also the co-founder of a makerspace called Crea Company. Travis was recently featured in the Washington Post for the really amazing creative work that he's doing, both as a pastor and as a co-founder of this Crea space. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about that in just a few minutes. But Travis, give us a sense of your context, maybe your church, the area where you're pastor, as we get started.
Absolutely. I pastor a church in Bluefield, West Virginia, kind of right in the heart of the coal fields. And it's an area that for the last 20, 30 years has really faced some significant economic struggles. Much of the mechanization that happened that drove jobs overseas, kind of the Rust Belt was the 80s. And then we moved into sort of the opioid epidemic before we moved into this pandemic. And so my joke is that epidemics, pandemics, that's what we do around here. So we feel in some ways comfortable in this setting. And you mentioned the entrepreneurial aspect. There's something to kind of the rules being changed that drives entrepreneurs.
Excellent. Looking forward to chatting in a second here, Travis. Our third and final panelist, another friend of Made to Flourish, Oye Waddell. And Oye Waddell is the executive director of Hustle Phoenix. Hustle Phoenix, as Oye will explain in just a second, works to train and develop entrepreneurs, oftentimes in underserved communities. And he's been doing that for a while. And a lot of people have gone through his program. He's an entrepreneur himself and an amazing leader. Oye is also the pastor at New City Church in downtown Phoenix. Oye, fantastic to have you on the webinar. Give us a little sense of your work and your context.
Sure, yeah. So actually, I just wanted to, the name of the organization is called Hustle Phoenix. That's what I lead now. I'm a husband of 17 years to one woman. I love my wife and I have 4 children. So like Michaela talked about her context of quarantine, my quarantine has been working, hustling, and then also with my kids hustling, trying to teach them. So it's been very interesting these last couple of months. But I would say in regards to our work, Hustle Phoenix, our mission statement is to empower men and women with intellectual, social, financial capital to start businesses that glorify God and serve their neighbors. So our context is urban inner city. So underserved, underrepresented entrepreneurs, really kind of getting behind them and giving them the tools they need, whether it be training and development, people, and then also money. We have a fund where we are able to launch and invest in the businesses that come through our network and our accelerator.
Awesome. Excited to chat more about that, Oye, in just a second. As we begin and before we kind of launch in with our panelists today, I want to start with a poll to just get a sense of what your mindset and how you think about yourself and your work during this time. So a poll is going to be coming up on your screen, and there's 2 questions that I'd love to have you answer. The first one is answer this statement: I consider myself to be an entrepreneurial leader. Very much so, somewhat, or not really. And then the second question, I enjoy dreaming up new ways of doing things, and change is exciting to me. We'll wait for some of the responses to come in there. As they're coming in, looks like we've got about 55, 56, 57 responses, charting over 60, close to 70 responses. It looks like about almost a third, 27% of you said, very much so, I consider myself an entrepreneurial leader. Most of you are in that somewhat. You're at about 50% of the people that are answering, that are coming in right now. You're saying, I kind of think of myself as an entrepreneurial leader. Maybe you're not totally comfortable with that title or not. And about 22% of you said, not really at all. That's not your jam. It's not how you think about yourself. So about 30%, 50%, and then 21%. The second question, I enjoy dreaming up new ways of doing things, and change is exciting to me. Actually, a much bigger percent of you said that very much so. You enjoy change and kind of reimagining things. Almost 2/3. So 65% of you answered in that way. About 30% said somewhat. And about 4% of you said not really at all. So the bulk of us here are at least somewhat comfortable with change and dreaming up new ways to think about our reality. So that's our context and who we are with this poll. So I'll share those results. You should be able to see those for a second if you want to take a look at those. Just a few final rules and things that are going to be going on as we do the rest of this Zoom call. The primary way that you can interact with us is through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So just click on that Q&A. And if at any point you have a question about something or a comment that one of the panelists is making, please just write in your answer or your comment or your question in that field. And we'll get to those sort of the second half of this call today. And then one final note that I'll mention, hopefully there's not going to be any Zoom bombing. We've taken steps to make sure that doesn't happen. But if for some reason someone is able to get in and do some Zoom bombing, we're just going to ignore it and keep learning today. So we're here to listen to our panelists. So we're going to start now with our first panelist, and we're going to start with Michaela, who's going to help us kind of establish a framework for how we think about an entrepreneurial mindset. What are the key aspects of an entrepreneurial mindset or an entrepreneurial posture, as Michaela talks about it? So help us translate this. Give us some tools and some context and some categories, Michaela.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. So I'll kind of go fast, and if I go too fast, then we can take up things later in the Q&A. I'm sure the other two sort of stories will fill some of this out as well. So I actually became an entrepreneur sort of by default in the last recession. So in 2008, I graduated with an MDiv from Fuller Seminary alongside my husband, who also was getting an MDiv. So if you ever thought an MDiv in a recessed economy was a shaky thing, try having two newly minted ones as a newly married couple. So we basically were there without like any money and really in the sense of how to do things in LA. And I come from a family of entrepreneurs. So just wired into my instincts of how to solve that problem was to start a business. So that's what we did. We started Long Winter. That's been going. Eventually I went back to get a PhD. That was part of my long-term plan. And night after night, we would have friends over to our house, and we ended up being surrounded by people who were a lot like us, people who had kind of had to figure out their own way in the middle of the recession. And that became the people group I was really interested in studying in my dissertation. I'm like, okay, so I come from a family of entrepreneurs. I've got a teacher's heart. What if the church could teach people to be entrepreneurial? Wouldn't that be a cool thing? That could be a way that we could really add value kind of in these changing times. So that was the question I went after in my dissertation. And I really wanted to know, okay, who are the people who are thriving and what are they doing? How is that happening? So these things I'm going to share with you come mostly from that research. Over the last 2 years, I've been at the Dupree Center at Fuller, and we've taken that research and we've put it into real resources, workshops and small learning cohorts, online things to really test and iterate and kick out what's bad and keep what's good. So it's not only just sort of this theoretical stuff. We've actually kind of been working with it for the last little bit. So I just want to say that there's a lot of kinds of entrepreneurs, and it's interesting even to see how you all responded in that first poll question. I find that when I go places, the word entrepreneur either kicks people all the way out or they're all the way in. They're like, yeah, I'm that, or no, I'm not that. And one of the things I've learned both in my research and just in time is that there's a lot of ways to start something and a lot of different kind of people who start something, which mean that there's actually not just one entrepreneurial posture or one entrepreneurial mindset. And I just say that for that to be freeing and liberating, and that, many kinds of people can sort of find their way into these different frameworks. So at the very, very just core of what entrepreneurs do, they do this. They seize opportunity to create value in the face of risk. Seize opportunity to create value in the face of risk. Well, that's literally the world right now. There's risk. Everything is sort of crashing around us. People are hungry for meaning and value in particular ways, specifically the church. And can we seize that opportunity? That's this really sort of what it comes down to. And of course, as Christians, that value we measure beyond financial or even social. We would sort of want to shape that in some kingdom impact, right? Whether that's shalom or redemption, or exactly how you want to articulate that based on your own context and language that you use in your church context. But seize opportunity to create value in the face of risk. Now, I did in my research, I wanted to know a bit about the muscles people have that help them do this more regularly. I love, Matt, you're in the beginning, you said this is a muscle a lot of us are dusting off. There's 3 things that came up, and that was the 3 muscles. And they're really, really encouraging, heartfelt muscles because they feel very human in addition to feeling entrepreneurial. Those 3 muscles are creativity, resiliency, and relational. And when I started to piece together, like, oh my goodness, creativity, that's our first story about God. Resiliency, that's our climactic story in Christ. And relational, like, hello, that's the church. I'm like, wow, this is actually a really like Christian way of being in the world, which happens to intersect with the sort of business framework of being an entrepreneur. That was quite exciting to me. But I wanted to know a bit more about, like, okay, how do we build these muscles? How do we strengthen them? How do we get in the gym? And so I asked the entrepreneurs in my study 4 basic questions. I asked them, how have you learned to define success? How have you learned to define failure? What practices have moved you towards success? And what practices have helped you deal with failure? So how do you define success, failure? What practices have moved you towards success? And what practices have helped you deal with failure? And interestingly, there were some pretty significant patterns. And I took what came up and eventually put those into a bit of a model. And there's 4 things here. And so these are things that came up in the research and then eventually came to the model. And I'll share these things. So the first thing is that entrepreneurs practice empathy on the way. My favorite story here is of an entrepreneur who started a large, one of the largest microfinancing organizations. And as she told me the story of how she founded it, she was already on a trip somewhere else when she happened to meet some people who could benefit from some small loan capital. So it was that she was walking in the path that she was already in and noticed needs along the way. That is, so empathy along the way. But excuse me, entrepreneurs don't just stop with empathy. There's this really interesting light bulb moment that happens where entrepreneurs can convert empathy into imagination. So number 1, practice empathy on the way. But number 2, convert empathy into imagination. So if empathy is the like, I see you, I feel you, it's the, good Samaritan on the side of the road, like I'm feeling moved towards my neighbor. Imagination is the what if. Like for the entrepreneur I told you about, like, what if we, matched people for, the Good Samaritan I just referenced? What if I went to this man and carried him along the way on the Jericho road, right? So convert empathy into imagination. The third is that you let that imagination fuel risk-taking. And this is where I want to just stop and say, it's just mostly about the next doable risk over and over. And this has been more true the more I've thought about it, even after the initial round of research. Most people are taking risk with the resources they already have. It's not necessarily like bet the farm, let's go get, 17 million in capital until we start something. It's like, what's the thing we can do today to learn more about what we ought to be doing tomorrow? And then finally, so practice empathy on the way, convert empathy into imagination, let imagination fuel risk-taking. And the last one is after risk, reflect. I was encouraged to find out that, in fact, one of the most common things entrepreneurs do is build in this really interesting spiritual and sort of business way, the question of like, what happened? How did it go? What did it mean? What worked? What didn't? And that's regularly an interval that I saw that then leads back into more empathy, right? Back into more risk-taking, back into more imagination. So that is a lot. And I'm like the person who throws a lot of facts and ideas sort of at you. But when we think about an entrepreneurial posture, it's really all of that kind of stuff. And it isn't meant to say you have to do all of that kind of stuff, but grab those things that work for you, grab the things that resonate, and you are behaving more entrepreneurially, whether you know it or not.
Michaela, one follow-up to that, because I love that kind of path that you provided. And it strikes me that that movement of the entrepreneur applies to every single person in the world if we want to love our neighbor, especially in a time of great need, right? There's empathy. There's like, okay, now I feel something for that person, like what could be done, imagination, that you take some sort of risk, whether that's financial, relational, time, and then you say like, how did that go? But I'm loving that kind of movement because it literally relates to every single person, no matter who they are in this moment.
Yeah, that's why I go back to the past. That's why I like putting the story of the person who started the $1 billion thing next to the story of the Good Samaritan, because the Good Samaritan is like, supposedly the social outcast or sort of looked down upon, but and chooses in a moment of risk, really, to attach his way forward on a probably already sort of vulnerable and dangerous path to the way forward of his neighbor. And it's in a most basic way. It's like, let me walk with you, right? Let me give you water and bandage your wounds. And I don't mean to say that that's not profound, because it is, but it's the scale of it is intimate and right there. And so, yeah, I think it's something for everybody on the smallest scale and the largest scale.
Fantastic. Well, there's so much more that we can talk about, and we will in a few minutes. So write any questions, comments as you think about your context. What would you like to interact with Michaela about here in a few minutes? But we're going to move now to our second panelist. And we're going to go to Travis Lowe, who's, as we mentioned, a pastor in Bluefield, West Virginia, very entrepreneurial pastor, and how he envisions his calling and the work that he's doing there in Bluefield. And Travis wrote an article a number of years ago that was on our Made to Flourish website. He said, "I've seen the future, and it looks a lot like Appalachia." Or as Travis would say, Appalachia, depending on where you're at in the country for how you say that. But I love the article, because basically what Travis was saying is a lot of the job loss, a lot of the displacement, it already happened 20 or 30 years ago. And if we're moving into a future, whether because of automation or a global pandemic or different things that we can't control, and people are going to be displaced, like there are parts of the country that have had to think about this for a long time. Many of our urban churches that we talk about, African-American churches, different underserved congregations have thought about this for a long time. And Travis has a lot of insights on how to be an entrepreneurial pastor and how to help his people think entrepreneurially. So Travis, would you tell us some of your story, your context, some of the steps that you've taken? And maybe you aren't using the categories that Michaela just outlined, but I think we'll see a lot of those similar themes in the way that you've responded. So talk a little bit about your story of what you've done in Bluefield.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Michaela, that was just absolutely brilliant. I so resonated with so much of what you said. And my background was in banking, finance, and when I became the pastor of the church, it was about 7 years ago, and we were really in a particularly hard economic spot in our part of the country. And that was really not anything new, because we had been there for quite some time, but it seemed especially hard. And I had several people in the church who were business owners who were trying very hard to just keep their business open. And this was particularly hard for people who it was a multi-generational business. It was second, third generation, and it looked like the doors were going to be closing on their watch. And I just naturally gravitated towards some of these folks, and I said, let's have lunch, let's talk about it. And we would get together, we would brainstorm, try to come up with ways that we could offer some kind of help. Maybe I had a relationship from past jobs. Maybe there was other people I knew in the community. And I found out very quickly as I was learning how to be a pastor, and it's funny I say that because the first couple of years I thought I was really good at being a pastor, and now I'm like realizing this is a very, very hard job. But as I was kind of in that stage, I would spend time with them and felt really comfortable, and we would begin to just kind of dream together, and we would make connections. And I realized that we had people in our church from like every socioeconomic level. We had people working in lots of different types of industries, and people in education, and people in government. And pastors are uniquely positioned, I believe, to be kind of a facilitator of relationships. And that's where we started, and we began to pull together lots of small business owners in our community and do a lot of networking events. And we saw a lot of work begin to happen locally. But what I recognized was the downturn in our economy had been really a 30-year issue. You could really say 40 years. And it had been a constant struggle to really pull out of it, and lots of poverty. We were beginning to see the life expectancy of men in our community go down, and they were attributing it to deaths of despair, lots of overdoses, lots of suicide. And as I began to face those things and kind of praying, seeking the peace and prosperity of our city, we recognized that a lot of the poverty was systemic. The effects of some of the coal mines that had laid off or closed down, the effects have been much larger than what maybe they should have been or what you would think they would have been. And we begin to recognize some of these systemic things just from the way that we think, the way that we view ourselves, what opportunities we believe that we have. And from there, I just wanted to do something. You mentioned the idea of imagination coming from empathy. And we would, probably one of the things that broke my heart the most was when I would ask a young person, a high schooler, middle schooler, what do you want to be when you grow up? And some of the folks that I talked to, it's almost like they hadn't thought about it. Their mind seems so close to opportunities. Like I have no opportunity. I will be whatever comes along. I have no choice in the matter. And so we began dreaming up ways that we could change the thinking, that we could step in. I know Brian Stevenson's quote that the opposite of poverty is actually justice. And these type of systemic type thoughts began to roll around, and we began to engage with it. And to the business owners who were in our community, we said, we think there's a couple ways that we could begin to turn the tide. And it was actually some research from Harvard on communities during the Rust Belt that had been able to recover and the ones that hadn't. And one of the things that they said is you have to help the current businesses retool, find a new market. And we were already doing that. The second thing they said was you need to have a focus on entrepreneurship. And what new businesses could you look at? And so we said, we want to be that focus on entrepreneurship. And the third thing it said is that you want to have your local business owners invested in the community, invested in a project, because if things get really bad, they can just move. They have the resources, they can go somewhere else. But if they're invested and committed to what you're doing, then they're more likely to stay and you're more likely to be successful. And so we pitched the idea of our makerspace. We call it Crea Company, and crea in Spanish is a verb that carries the idea of making. With the makerspace, we just thought that was a good connection, but it's also where we get the word creation, so the idea of making, creating. But it also has a separate meaning, and it can mean believe. And it's where we get the idea of creed. So this idea of creation and creed being tied together, and so we kind of took that and played off of it that making and believing are connected. And then those words make believe just brings the idea of imagination. And we just dug into that idea. And we said, we want to do something here that would just inspire the imagination of the people that live here, expand their imagination, cultivate their imagination. And so we began with the framework from MIT of they called it a Fab Lab at the time. It's something that they've kind of discontinued their program, but it was digital fabrication. And we asked the local business owners to kind of get behind us in this project. And we had business owners donate things for an auction and donate money. And we were able to buy all of the equipment that we have just from the investment of the local business owners. We bought 3D printers and laser cutters, CNC routers, vinyl cutters, heat presses, those kind of things. And we began just last year, November of last year, to open up this building. We worked in connection with our city, who had received a grant to restore an old railroad building. And they believe in what we're doing, and we've been highly invested in what they're doing. So they have given us one of the buildings here to use, and we moved in, started in November with memberships where people in the community could pay a small monthly fee and have access to all of our tools, and we would train them to use it. And we had several people starting businesses from the tools that we had, but just, kind of 4 months in, we see the quarantine. And we didn't make people sign lengthy membership agreements or contracts. So as soon as quarantine started, we saw our memberships decrease significantly. And that was a time where it was like, what are we going to do? How are we going to continue to pay what bills that we have? But it was also a time that you saw makers around the country just begin to rise up. And they started making PPE equipment. And I said, I believe I could do that. And so I was driving up to the shop by myself, making PPE equipment, and we began to tell our story in the community, and people in the community got excited. And for Easter Sunday, I had different families from my church sign up for an hour all day long. And for 24 hours, we had families in the shop making PPE equipment for our local hospital. And that was the story that the Washington Post covered and brought tremendous, press to what we were doing. And then opened up doors. So we had people actually from around the country begin to get the membership for a small monthly fee that would never come to our building, but just to kind of support what we were doing. And as we did that, we began to see more opportunities. So anytime behaviors change, there's tremendous opportunity. Masks started being something that were being suggested or required, so we started making masks. And our church doesn't have a lot of finances, so being able to help people who were struggling, who had lost their jobs, we didn't have a lot of money to do that. But I was able to begin to hire some of the ladies from the church to come and make masks that we're selling to ladies in the church. We paid over $4,000 salary to them last year, which was more than last month. That was more than what they were making before the quarantine, just to be making masks. And then we had a person who had donated some tools for small engine repair. And we had some men that were struggling with their business because they just didn't have as many orders. And I said, why don't you come and start a small engine repair shop? And so we started a small engine repair shop. We've bought sewing machines, and we've got masks going out the doors every day. We've started branding the mask and selling them to churches. And it's just been an incredible time. So it's been a time of great excitement for us. Not everything we've done has worked, but it's been... It has been more fun and more exciting than I would have ever dreamed in the midst of great risk. And so that was the other part that I loved about what you shared, was that empathy driving to imagination. And then once you step out, because none of this was a huge investment for us, but we just began to use what we have and to move forward. And man, it's just been a tremendous opportunity for our church and our community.
Well, thank you, Travis. And so inspiring to hear the work that you're doing, and just the fact that as a pastor, you were thinking in this way, and to say, yeah, this is part of my shepherding role, so that you're in a position how many years later when this has been developed, people are coming and they're asking, is there a benevolence fund? Is there anything you can do to help? You can actually say, sure, want a job. It's just a beautiful story about how the church can get involved, and what you've done in a context that probably some people have written off, and they're saying you need to move, or like the systemic injustices are too strong. You're just going to have to, go somewhere else, or, but you've acted entrepreneurially. So thank you for your example. Really fantastic. We're going to go on to Oye Waddell, and Oye is, as I mentioned, he himself is an entrepreneur, an incredible leader, and he is training entrepreneurs in the urban core of Phoenix and giving them the skills and the social capital, the intellectual capital, the financial capital that they need to be successful. But Oye, give us a little bit of your story, and what are you training these people on, and what skills are you seeing them take on? Give us a little sense of kind of the secret sauce of the work that you do.
Yes. So first of all, thank you again, Matt, for allowing me to speak on this call today. I think one of the things that we really focus on with Hustle Phoenix is really helping people understand team, right? I think a lot of times when we think about entrepreneurship, when we think about the entrepreneurial mindset, it's really about, we immediately think about, hey, this sole entrepreneur going and taking the heel, right? But entrepreneurship, the one thing I love about business and entrepreneurship is so much about team, right? If you want to truly build a solid business, team, it takes a team, and the team stands for together, everyone achieves more, right? And so as together, as a community or a group, that we can come together, we achieve more together. And so one of the things I think about business, one of the first things we talk about in Hustle Phoenix, when we train entrepreneurs, and I'll give a brief, I'll talk a little bit more detail what we do with Hustle Phoenix, but we train entrepreneurs to look at problems that they see in the community or in the world, and how are you going to create a solution to it? And how are you going to create a sustainable solution to it? Obviously through commerce, people paying for that product or service. And so what we do at Hustle Phoenix, when we talk about the intellectual, we talk about the capacity, I always call it the blocking and tackling of business, really helping folks understand how do you run a successful business, to everything from how do you look at the financials, how do you study your financials to figure out where your business is hurting, or where, how can you execute even better in certain areas, to how do you pitch your idea, to how to create a marketing plan. And so the way it works essentially is we have kind of 3 levels: 101, we call it 101, 202, 303. Ironically enough, it's the freeways here locally in Phoenix. But the 3 phases of entrepreneurship as we see it is ideation, validation, and execution. Ideation is helping entrepreneurs kind of go through that beginning phase of, hey, what am I trying to do? How do I want to engage with the world? Validation is really getting mentors and people around the idea to validate the idea, going out and doing what we call R&D, or just trying to sell or market your product to see who's interested in it. And then execution is really that next phase of how do you launch and grow and scale. And so our focus is urban inner city. That's what we see. We see we've been doing it for a few years now, and we see a massive opportunity, not only in Phoenix, but all over the country. There are men and women in urban inner cities that are trying to do business. And a lot of times they're doing business illegally through drug sales and things of that nature. But we say, look, what does it look like for the church to respond to some of these massive issues that we have in our country, whether it be through incarceration or drug sales or illegal activity in our world, in our country? And we say, look, economics is a big part of it. I mean, God talks about it all throughout the scripture, and we see it. And so we said, if we're not speaking and we're not being relevant to the culture and in regards to how does the gospel speak to these issues of economics in urban inner city communities? And we believe it's through hustling, all right? And so we say, look, our mission again is to start business, to help entrepreneurs start businesses, to empower them to love God and love their neighbor. And we believe that as they're in right relationship with God and they continue to love their neighbor as their customer, like if they're treating their customer as their neighbor and continue to love them, if the market needs what they have, their business will grow, right? And so we really see that. But in regards to entrepreneurial mindset, and I think entrepreneurship and pastoring, I think there's some similarities, but there are a lot of differences too. But I think even for entrepreneurs, right, there's a few practices that I think that we train our entrepreneurs to do when it comes to launching and growing a business. And the first thing is prayer, right? And being in prayer, starting with prayer. Not everybody's a Christian in our network, and that's okay. But we encourage entrepreneurs to pray, stop, slow down, pray. Ask God to let you open up your eyes to see new opportunities, right? And the only way we could honestly pray, I think prayer begins with humility. And it's funny, I was reading Ephesians 4, 1 through 16 last night, and I'm like, man, there's so many similarities to what Paul was teaching in Ephesians 4 to essentially what we're doing, where we are now as the church and entrepreneurship, right? And I think Ephesians 4:1, when Paul tells the Ephesians church, like, hey, listen, walk with humility and gentleness. And as entrepreneurs, I think Michaela talked about it. We need to walk with humility and gentleness as entrepreneurs, as pastors. And I think the way we do that is through prayer, right? And I think another thing we talk about, if we think about that entrepreneurial mindset, and I know one of the things we start with in the very, very beginning when we train our entrepreneurs, and I think everybody should go through this process, is we coined it from Simon Sinek, is start with why. And your why is about your story, right? And we all understand as believers that we are part of God's big story, right? We are playing a part in God's big story. But our why is so much about our history, where we grew up, what has shaped us. And I've coined the term, like, if your why does not make you cry, it's not big enough, right? And I'll say it again. If your why does not make you cry, it's not big enough. And so as pastors, as leaders, especially now during COVID-19, with that entrepreneurial mindset, we need to go back to our why. Like, why are we doing what we're doing, right? And I think those are good questions to ask, because as we start to dig into our story, we start to even delve in more into God's story, into the scripture, we see that. And I think in Ephesians 4, Paul models it when we think about our why. In Ephesians 4:12, Paul gave him a why. He said, listen, it's to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, right? As he was talking to the church for building up the body of Christ. And so I think with that entrepreneurial mindset, how it connects to pastors, entrepreneurs, is to equip. And you see entrepreneurs doing that. Entrepreneurs are equipping. They have to equip their staff. They have to equip the people that they're marketing to. They have to, sometimes entrepreneurs have to create and create an appetite for things that people don't even know what they want. But that's all a part of the discipleship process. And as entrepreneurs, we're continuously doing that as well as pastors. And I think the last piece is prayer, start with why, and then knowing yourself. And that's kind of those are the three kind of, before we even get into how do you, I call it the X's and O's of the blocking and tackling of starting a business. We start with these three: prayer, start with why, and then knowing yourself. And the reason why that's so important, because a lot of times as entrepreneurs, we can operate out of our gift set, right? Like not everybody's an entrepreneur, but an entrepreneur needs different people on their team to play their role so that their business can grow. Just like as a pastor, right? Like all pastors don't have all of the gifts, right? So we need people on our team to play the role so we can build up the body. But knowing yourself, when I think about knowing yourself, is how has God wired you, and what are your guiding principles, right? Like how did God uniquely gift you to be able to be a blessing in the community that you're in? I think we need to ask ourselves those questions during this time, because a lot of times I've been in churches where the preaching was held at such a high level. Other folks that had other gifts outside of preaching were kind of like pushed down, like, hey, you don't really have a huge role in this church because you don't have the preaching gift, right? But there's so many other gifts to build up the body, right? And so I think about Ephesians 4:11, when Paul, again, is talking to the church. There's different gifts. You need to know yourself. Are you apostle, prophet, teachers, and shepherds to build up, the church? And so I think I want to end it with those three things, right? We think about entrepreneurial mindset: prayer, stopping, having the humility, understanding your why, but then also knowing yourself. How has God wired you? I think when I think about these things, when we do these things in Hustle, we're really trying to encourage people, again, to be a part of a team. Like initially, when you start a company, a lot of times you do it on your own. But if you think about it, as you want to grow your business, we're saying, listen, you need to have a team. You need to have a family. You need to be working together with people, because business is a team sport. Right. And I think, again, I liken it to Paul, like in Ephesians 4:16, when Paul's saying, look, we do these things, the whole body joined together. When we have the whole body joined together, everybody playing their part on the team, listen, the body will grow in love. Right. And I think when we see successful businesses that are growing in love, the team is working together. Everybody's playing their part. And I think when we think about COVID-19, how this has impacted the church, how to have an entrepreneurial mindset, I think the one word that keeps coming to me is like discipleship. And I know that's kind of coin that we throw that around, but thinking through different models to disciple the people in our congregations and in our communities, I think we have to do it, because man, this has been challenging. It's been challenging for many leaders, not only here in Phoenix, but across the country. And I think looking at different discipleship models, even pastors being in discipleship community. I think a lot of times as pastors, we're the lone ranger, right? And we have no one to go to. But being in intentional discipleship groups, whether it be smaller groups, right? Like a lot of times, a lot of us are preaching through Zoom, which is okay for now, right? And we're used to having this traditional model where people come to our congregations and they listen to us speak and teach or whatever. And I think this is forcing us to shift and say, listen, how are we getting smaller groups of people, familiar relationships, working together, working as a team, and to love each other and to build up the body. I think those are just a few things that I think as pastors, having that entrepreneurial mindset, being okay with change, and looking at the opportunities.
Yeah.
That's what we need to do and continue to do it as we move forward into this.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good, Oye. You know, we serve a little over 3,300 pastors in the Made to Flourish network, and many of them lead churches that in some cases are very small staff, maybe one, maybe two pastors, and they feel really isolated and they're wondering what to do, and maybe they have some friends, but that idea of team, who are the key people, who are the key leaders in the congregation that you can come along to be your team, and even those three categories of ideate and figure out what is the idea, and then to go on and you're testing that hypothesis, and then you're actually you're putting it into practice. Those three categories that you gave. What were the three categories again? I forget the three categories.
Yeah, ideation. Those are the three steps of business: ideation, validation, and execution.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And even with something as simple as like, how are we thinking about gathering the congregation back? Those three categories are really, really helpful. I want to go back to Michaela. We're going to do some Q&A now. And if you have questions, send those into the Q&A tab that you have. And we're going to walk through those in just a second. Michaela, you talked about sort of, starting with empathy and then going to this what if question. Are there practices, or are there any ways that we can think about kind of that first and second stage, both cultivating empathy, but also kind of spurring the imagination? As people think there are these two categories and they're thinking about their church context or their business context, what practices can they be doing? And then also there was a question here about the 3 R's that you mentioned. I don't know if you had 3 R's, but your categories again would be helpful. So.
Creativity, resilience, and relational. So 1 C, 2 R's, creativity, resilience, and relational. Yeah. In terms of practices, I heard so much in Travis and Oye's stories, which were really fun to hear and resonate with just some other things. I think there's one that I've been talking with people about right now that I think is actually really important. And that is this kind of like 2-part relationship between grief and creativity. So it's really, it's exciting to like notice the new opportunities, but there's so much taxation happening like mentally and emotionally and spiritually right now. That's why I love Oye's call to spend time in prayer. I would sort of more broadly frame kind of the practice that leads to that empathy as just like listening. And I do think that there's a particular kind of stillness that we're having to like cultivate more regularly right now, because our hearts and minds are overwhelmed or moving fast or checking out and doing different things. So, we all have our different practices for stillness and for listening. I particularly love Examine. Why do I love Examine? Because it just makes me go back through the day, and it makes me like hear what actually happened in the day. And over the course of several days, and we've made some pivots at the Dupree Center, and it's over the course of several days and I'm noticing the patterns of what I'm hearing, what we together are hearing, that some of that empathy starts to like kind of come alive in a not just a momentary way. So the prayer of Examine is I think a really healthy one right now, practices that help us do that kind of stopping. In terms of imagination, I think there's so many ways to go. Certainly there's like everything in the like team brainstorm world, which I think can be a spiritual practice actually, by the way, like brainstorming. I think that, if you've got people on your team who are sort of coming at it from that angle, I think that can be brainstorming. I think that can be spiritual practice. I also think something like Lectio Divina can be an interesting practice for imagination, Visio Divina, something that really says like, okay, we're going to look at something and we're going to let our mind expand. And if you're doing that in light of kind of that empathy, I think that's helpful. So you'll notice, especially right now, the practices, at least I feel most drawn to, are practices of kind of quiet, because my own pace wants to quicken right now. And I think that the counterbalance to being able to both grieve and create are some practices of stillness and listening.
That's great. I want to go to Travis now, and I'll kind of tie two questions together, Travis. First, there was a question that came in of just like your business model. You're a pastor, you're a church. Is that set up as a 501c3? Is it a separate organization? I think as some of churches are thinking about how would we create something like that, is it better kind of on a for-profit model or a nonprofit model, or what is the relationship to the church? And then secondly, as kind of another question that I want you to answer about CreaSpace. Sometimes when we're thinking entrepreneurial, whether as a pastor or not, there's kind of this desire to almost like hype things up and to say, this thing is going to be awesome and we're going to do this thing. And you can only do that so many times if like the direction changes. You talked about a little bit of a directional change that you made early on with a program with IT, but what language can a leader use even as they're leading entrepreneurial with others in a way that doesn't sort of hype and get people feeling like, oh yeah, pastor's got a new idea, but kind of still allows them to jump in. So first the business model and any tips on language.
Sure. For our business model, we worked through that question quite a bit, just deciding which way we wanted to go. And I don't know if there's a right answer or a wrong answer for that. We decided to go the for-profit model. And it was more just from I was thinking if we're going to be raising up entrepreneurs and wanting them to start businesses and wanting them to be successful, then I didn't want the business that we were starting up to be completely dependent on donations. I wanted to raise up something that would stand on its own, that would make a profit, that would be a viable business. And doing it that way has kind of put us in the place to where we have to figure out ways to make a budget. And I think that practice is very helpful when you're trying to help other people, because you're there, you're trying to figure out how you're going to make payroll, you're trying to figure out how you're going to do these things. And it's not always just, from a fundraising standpoint. And so we decided to set it up that direction. You mentioned the hype standpoint. This project here has been a several-year project to get it to where it's going. And I would say that I fell into that trap early on. Like I was talking about it, I was telling everybody about it. But we were working with our local city government grant programs through the EDA for the building. And it ended up taking about 2 years longer than what I had thought that it would take. And so it definitely puts a damper on all of your hype talk. I mean, we had almost we had went different directions in other programs before this ever kind of came about. And then this almost just popped back up on our radar after we had almost put it off to the side. So I really have found in our community, there's been so many people that have came in with programs, or this is going to fix everything, this is going to do it. When you use that hype, it's almost more of a negative than a positive, because everybody's like, here's another person telling us how we're going to do it and how it's going to happen. And they would much rather you tell your story once you've started. And I think that is often what I found for churches or for people thinking about the entrepreneurial type steps is just take the next step. I loved what Michaela said, the next doable risk. Just take the step. And it doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't always have to work, but I think we've missed so many opportunities because we're trying to frame everything right. We're trying to sell everything right. I say take the step and then tell the story from there. And even if it's a story of it not working out right, I found those to be just as powerful of stories for people that are in the same situation.
Yeah, that's great. And what I love about what you've done, Travis, is you weren't someone from outside of Bluefield kind of coming in with solutions. Number one, you were embedded in the community, but even you didn't say, we're going to do this thing that I thought of. You were practicing empathy, listening to community leaders. There were ideas that were emerging from the group, and then you began to take steps. So it wasn't kind of the genius with a million helpers around you, but you had people that were speaking into it, and you were kind of practicing empathy and imagining together and taking risks together as a group. So thank you for your great modeling. I want to turn to Oye now. And I don't know how many entrepreneurs have been through your program at Hustle Phoenix, but can you think of one or two stories of people who have gone through your program? They've launched out, they've taken a risk, they've been through this process that we've been talking about. And what did they experience personally in terms of personal growth or spiritual growth or just any sort of growth that you saw? What did the entrepreneurial journey look like for them through the things that you taught them?
Yeah, so I think honestly, I'm gonna share one story, but I think if you all have some opportunity, if you go to, we have a partnership with a TV station here locally where they share our entrepreneur stories online or live on TV. It's called AZTV7. So if you go to aztv7.com/hustlephx, you can see a number of different stories of our entrepreneurs and how hustle has been an impact in their lives. But I would say one of the stories I like to tell is one lady. Her name was Blanca. She's a Hispanic lady. She runs a flower shop, and her husband is a barber. He runs his own barbershop. And as Blanca came through our accelerator, one of the things that she really resonated with her is the why, right? And I talked about a little bit about that earlier. And the reason why it resonated with her, because she saw her business much more larger than just, hey, economic transactions. I have flowers. I deliver great flowers to people here all throughout the community. But she seen really her business as a transformational agent to change the entire trajectory of her family. And so one of the things is, so you see Blanca, her because she started a business, her husband runs a barbershop. Her son runs a shaving cream business. He came through Hustle. And then her daughter runs a candy business, right? Like her running a business has changed the entire trajectory of her family. And then now other people in her family see, and this happens to a lot of our entrepreneurs, other people in their family and their friends see them starting a business. And then they say, you know what? They can do it. I have something that's been burning in me. I want to do it. So one of the things at Hustle, we say we're not just helping people start businesses for the common good. We're helping change generations, right? And because when you start a company, it's ownership. And especially in urban inner city communities, the history that we have in America, whether it be through African American, Latino, Native American, right? Like ownership a lot of times has been taken away from people here historically. Right. And the church, a lot of the churches had a lot to do with it. And so we're saying, listen, how do we restore the ownership, this sense of ownership and change generations through entrepreneurship? So it's much bigger than just in dollars and cents and making money. We always say we have people's lives at stake, right? Because generations are changing because people are starting companies.
Oh, yeah, that's really beautiful. I think we just heard your why that makes you cry. And just to say, there's been communities that have been largely neglected and things have been taken away. Let's get on the solution side and to allow them to begin the process of wealth creation, not simply as getting rich, but to have assets and to bring stability to their family and to have a place where they can create and kind of that pride of offering something up to God that they're doing. So thank you for your work. We're going to do two more questions that are lightning round. So 1 minute questions each. Michaela, you are embedded in a seminary, Fuller, even though Dupree is kind of an organization that's kind of an affiliate. I know you're connected to Fuller, but can you talk a little bit about the role that seminaries might play to train pastors to have more of an entrepreneurial mindset? You've talked about some of the things that you've done. Any ideas for on the seminary level? You yourself are an entrepreneur. Try to take a minute, and then we'll give the last word to Travis.
There's so much exciting opportunity here. I think it's probably critical to the way forward. Seminaries are usually large institutions, which don't turn nearly as fast as small organizations. So we'll see. I am very practically though, I am teaching a DMin course on this stuff. So it's sort of making its way into the curriculum, at least a little bit at a time.
Excellent. Thank you. And if any of you are connected to seminaries, Michaela would be a fantastic person to bounce ideas off of and compare notes. I want to give the last word to Travis because some of the people that are listening are pastors, and one person wrote, sometimes as pastors, we aren't risk takers. Even though like faith is trusting God in what is unknown, we don't really like risk. And we like to do things maybe that have worked in other places or things that we've done before. Can you talk about maybe not a theology of risk, but how can you think about taking risks as a pastor? And what does that look like?
Absolutely. I think, number one, I believe that as pastors, we are good at building trust and developing trust. And I think of trust as a type of risk. I see those two things as being very connected. And so as you begin to trust someone, or as you begin to develop trust, they're taking a risk by trusting you. And we're encouraging our folks to take risks. But I would also say that Christians should be the biggest risk takers in the world, because we really believe that we're sheltered in the arms of God. I mean, the worst thing in the world could happen and we still win. I mean, we are the safest folks. So I always try to position that to people, that we really believe that even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, He is with me. Why could I not take a risk? Why could I not throw it out there? I have God on my side. So that helps me out personally.
Yeah, and just framing it like Michaela did is the next thing. It's not always this grand, massive thing, but it's the next decision that we make in taking the risk. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us for this week's Common Practice webinar, Pastoring with an Entrepreneurial Mindset. I hope it spurred entrepreneurial thinking in your leadership, and we certainly ask God's hand of favor on you as you experiment with new things, as you practice empathy and ideation and validation and execution and all these things that we've been talking about today. We are going to be back next week, again, with another Common Practice webinar. Details will be coming out that early next week. And then the final word to say is, if you are not connected to Made to Flourish, if you go to our website, madetoflourish.org, in the upper right-hand corner, click Start Now. And if you've never done that before, we'll send you a free box of resources and some things to get you on your way to exploring more of these ideas. We're so grateful that you joined us today, and we'll see you next week in another Common Practice webinar. Bye-bye.